So, today's talk is Mishnah 5, Pirkei Avot chapter 1. Now, I started it last week, also on Monday, but I left out one part because the discussion becomes quite involved. Yosi Ben Yohanan. We had the pair of two people. First part of the pair was Yosi Ben Yohanan, who I talked about last week, and the Av Beit Din, the head of the court of the Sanhedrin of this time, was Yosi Ben Yohanan of Yerushalayim, both of them students of Antigonos Ish Socho. And Yosi Ben Yohanan says, may your house be open, wide open to the poor. Let the poor be in your household. And do not talk too much with a woman. Now this is a very unusual Mishnah. You see, beforehand we said, based on the idea of the brought by Kahati, where Kahati said that Shimon HaTzadik said that there are three things upon the world stands: Torah, divine worship, the service of God, and charity, or doing good deeds. And I said Antigonos talks about divine service, where he talks about the love and fear of God, and not to expect a reward. And then last week, Yosi Ben Yohanan talked about the study of Torah in the sense of loving the scholars of Torah. And this week, Yosi Ben Yohanan talks about the fact that you should have the poor in your house, which is Gemilut Chasadim. So where does this statement about the woman come in all of a sudden? Now, both of them are talking about the house. Yosi Ben Yohanan, may your house be a place where the scholars assemble. And of course, Yosi Ben Yohanan, may your house be a place where the poor can assemble. Now, of course, the woman in Antiquity is the woman of the house. As it says, one of the scholars in the Talmud says, I never called my house my wife, I called my wife my house. She's a keret habayit, she's the one who takes care of the house. Now, what is this statement? Then one is al tarbeh siha Ha-Isha. And when we go a little bit further, the statement seems to continue. Not only does it say not to talk too much with a woman, but then it continues. B'ishto amru, they were talking about his wife. Kal v'chomer be'eshet chavero, even more so, a fortiori that you shouldn't talk too much with somebody else's wife. And from here, the sages said that any person who talks too much with a woman brings evil to themselves and botel midivrei Torah, which means he is keeping himself away from the words of the Torah, and this, of course, would make him inherit Gehinom, which is loosely translated as hell. So, what's going on? And are we finding one of the early statements of misogyny in our tradition? Is one of the questions you could ask. And the truth is that the whole wording here is very strange, because it starts with Yosi Ben Yohanan, and then it says, and from this did they say. Who's they? Who's the they here? And then it says, and therefore the sages said, which sages? This is a very strange statement. And in fact, it's the first time in Pirkei Avot where it's not clear who's talking. And what's it doing here in the first place? Okay, before we get into this statement, I'd like to talk about the changing place of women in Antiquity. Now, we have to understand a few things. Number one, until the 20th century, the world is a patriarchal world. And I'm not here to suggest differently. Right? Basically, Antiquity is a patriarchal world, where human beings see themselves as families, and the head of the family is the man, and the woman is in charge of the house. This is true of all of the ancient world and the modern world until the 20th century. Remember, the vote was given to women, let's say in England, after the First World War. Because until then, it was understood that the man is in charge of the house, so that's why he should vote. Why should the woman vote? Okay? This was just the thinking up until the 20th century. It's not so long ago. It's not that there weren't differences. It's not that we're not changing statuses of women in antiquity. There were. And to understand the nuances, you have to understand what period you're talking about, because there are differences. Even in a patriarchal world, there can be different levels on how you see a woman. Give you an example. The word misogyny, which means to hate women, is a Greek word. It's not for no reason it's a Greek word. Greek culture had its tendency to be misogynist. We have statements about women in Greek culture of being objects, sometimes belittling women. This continues into Roman culture, but this is not in every culture. In the Persian culture, for instance, there was a certain feminine mystique that the culture recognized. There was a certain power to the female that Persian culture recognized in antiquity. When I say Persian culture, I mean from the time of Koresh, Cyrus, the king of Persia, the first king of Persia, the one who grants the Jews the right to build the second temple, and until the time when the Persians are basically conquered by the Romans around, or at least in this part of the world, around 60-something before the Common Era. Of course, it goes, earlier than that, by the Greeks already in 332 before the Common Era. So basically, the Persian Empire has this concept of the female mystique. Let me give you an example. In Josephus Flavius's Antiquities, his book on the Antiquities of the Jews, in Book 11, Chapter 3, he tells the story how Darius, who according to his chronology comes right after Cyrus, Darius makes a feast. And in this feast, before the feast, he wants to ask a question, and it keeps him up all night. And he's willing to give a gift to somebody who will tell him what the answer to the puzzle is. What is the strongest thing in the world? Is it wine? Is it the king? Or is it women? Okay. Darius is wondering, what is the most powerful thing in the world? Is it wine? Is it monarchy? Or is it a woman? Okay. Now, among the Greeks and the Romans, this would not even be a question. But among the Persians, this is a very significant question. And then it continues in chapter 3 that he brings all these people together, all these scholars. By the way, among them, Zerubbabel is one of the scholars, the one who leads the Jews eventually in the second temple back to Israel. And the first one gets up and talks about the strength of wine and demonstrates it. He says, look, I'll give you my opinion of wine. It exceeds everything. It deceives the mind of those who drink it. It reduces a king to the state of an orphan in need of a tutor. It makes a slave bold, and the needy become like the rich. It renews the soul. So, wow, this is very powerful stuff. So definitely wine must exceed everything if it can make the king into an orphan. After he gave this demonstration about the strength of wine, the next person began to speak and talked about the strength of the king and demonstrated that this is the most powerful of all, because the king can govern all men and force the earth and the sea to become profitable, rules over men and animals, etc. So definitely the king must be the strongest of all. Chapter 5. Now when this man had held his peace, the third of him, who was Zerubbabel, the Jew, began to instruct them about women and about something they didn't talk about, truth. And he said, wine is strong, and so is the king, whom all men must obey. But women are superior to them in power, for it is a woman who brought the king into the world, and who plants the vines that make the wine. They are women who bear them and bring them up. and they make the garments, and they control our household affairs. So, and we can't live separate from them. So women are definitely the strongest of all. And he says, and look, when we got a great deal of gold and silver and other things of great value, and we see a beautiful woman, we're willing to forsake all that just for the woman. We leave our father and our mother and the earth that nourishes us for the sake of a woman, and he goes on and on. And when the princes and the rulers looked upon each other, then Zerubbabel spoke about the truth. And he says, I've already demonstrated how powerful women are, but both these women themselves and the king are weaker than truth. For even if the earth be large and the heaven high, yet all those move according to the will of God, who is true and righteous. So when Zerubbabel left off his discourse about the truth, the multitude cried out aloud and said, he was the most wise of all, and because the king thought that Zerubbabel was so wise, he allowed him to lead the Jews back to Jerusalem. Okay, Josephus' Antiquities, chapter 11, book 11 from chapter 3. So, you have this concept in Persian culture of antiquity. At the beginning of the Second Temple, the feminine mystique, the power of women. That women are considered more powerful than men. It's not that the culture is not patriarchal, but they realize there's a certain value and power to the woman. They're very aware of this. If you notice, in our Bible, there is a book called the Book of Esther. Okay, it's a book named after a woman who overpowers the king, and it's written during the Persian era. That's not a mistake. Okay, the feminine mystique. Esther can overpower the king and overpower the viceroy, Haman. Mordecai can't do it. Only Esther can. Now, it's true you could argue and say, well, there's another book called Ruth, and that's named after a woman too. That is true. And according to our tradition, Samuel, who is much earlier, writes Ruth. However, Ruth does not really overpower in the end of the day. She's responsible for bringing King David into the world, eventually, over the generations. That's the reason for the book. And yes, she is a woman of righteousness. It's not the same thing. It's not really showing power, it's showing character, yes. But not like in the Esther story with political power and maneuvers that women can do. In fact, we have another book, which is not in our Bible, the Book of Judith, which is part of the Apocrypha, meaning the books that never made it into the Bible. Judith was actually considered part of the Christian Bible in the early Vulgata. And but now, even though there was a Jewish tradition at some point to read Judith during the festival of Hanukkah, it actually predates Hanukkah. It's actually closer to the Persian era. And that's why in Judith, you have a woman overpowering a general. Now, we have that also in the Bible. It's true. Sisera and Yael overpowers Sisera. But I'm just saying, the book of Judith also represents this influence of Persian culture where the woman has the political power and cunning to do things. So I'm just saying that antiquity is not all equal. It's not that every culture sees the woman the same just because these are patriarchal societies. The Persians had this mystique about the power of women, but the Greeks and to a great extent the Romans had no problem with misogyny and no problem putting women down. It was something they didn't have a problem with. If anything, they talked about the beauty of men and less about the beauty of women. So we just have to realize we're talking about cultural differences. Now, having said that, where does that put us? We're talking about Yosi Ben Yohanan. Now, Yosi Ben Yohanan lives in the 2nd century before the Common Era. That means he's living just at the beginning of the Hasmonean period. So the Greeks have already entered. You have the Seleucid government. Now the Seleucid government So basically, Yosi Ben Yohanan is living right at the beginning, I would call, of the Greek era. Right? If it takes 332 when Alexander conquers this area, even the 2nd century before the Common Era, 160, 180 before the Common Era, and it could be he's even earlier than that. He might be about 220 before the Common Era. It might be the beginning of the 3rd century even when he is born. But we're not very far into the Greek culture, so that we're still borderline between Persian influences on the one side and Greek influences on the other side. So the question is, what's going on with Yosi Ben Yohanan? Is he making a misogynist statement, yes or no? Now, I want to argue no. Okay? And you're going to say, how can you say no? I mean, look what it says here. Okay, first of all, I'm going to argue no by telling you something which I'm not sure you know about, and that is that not everything that's written in Mishnah 5 was written by Yosi Ben Yohanan, and I'm going to prove it. Yosi Ben Yohanan says, your house should be open to the poor. He also says and that the poor be part of your household. And then he also says, and don't talk too much to the wife. He does say that. But he doesn't say what it says after. The whole quote after, and if we're talking about if it meant your wife, even more so the wife of your friend, and therefore the sages said, any man who talks too much with a woman is bringing evil to himself and taking away time for Torah study and deserves going to Gehenna. All that is superimposed on this Mishnah and was not originally part of the Mishnah. The Mishnah stopped after, and do not talk too much idle talk with your wife, period. How do I know that? I will prove it. This is called Avot de Rabbi Natan. Avot de Rabbi Natan is a commentary on Pirkei Avot, a very early commentary. In fact, in the Encyclopedia Judaica, the author there, who's writing in the 1970s, actually thinks that the Avot de Rabbi Natan is written as early as the time of Judah Nasi, who is the redactor of the Mishnah. However, later scholarship seems to claim that the Avot de Rabbi Natan, which is written like a Talmudic discussion on Pirkei Avot, on the ethics of the fathers, it's like the Gemara of the Mishnah, the ethic of the fathers, seems to be put together, or at least edited, during the time of the Geonim, anywhere between the 7th and the 9th century, which would, by the way, put it in Islamic, under Islamic influence, which is, again, a society which sees women probably not that much different than the Greeks and the Romans. Now, let me read to you the statement in Avot de Rabbi Natan. First, they quote the Mishnah in Avot, and then they bring their commentary. Yosi Ben Yohanan. This is chapter 6, Gimel. Chapter 6, Gimel. No, excuse me, chapter 6, chapter 7. Yosi Ben Yohanan, and he calls him Yosef here, says, your house should be open, wide open for the poor who should be part of your household. And do not talk idle talk. By the way, siha is always idle talk. Do not talk idle talk with the woman, period. And then it starts explaining, what does it mean that your house be open for this? And what does it mean? Okay. And then later on it goes in part 2. It says, and what does it mean? Al tarbeh siha Ha-Isha, you shouldn't talk too much with a woman. It means even your wife. And this means that if it's not your wife, for sure not. Because any time a person talks too much with a woman, it brings evil to themselves and keeps themselves away from Torah and brings them to Gehenna. In other words, what we read in Mishnah of Pirkei Avot is not from Pirkei Avot. It was superimposed on Pirkei Avot. It's actually taken from the commentary of Avot to Rabbi Natan. Why was it thrown into Pirkei Avot? I don't know, because a lot of Avot to Rabbi Natan was not. It's very unusual that the commentary from Avot to Rabbi Natan be thrown in there, but it's obvious from the commentary of Avot to Rabbi Natan, which is definitely no later than the Gaonic period of 7th to the 9th century, that for them, in Pirkei Avot, it stopped with, and don't talk too much with the woman. They even give another interpretation. What does it mean, don't talk too much with a woman? Because when a man talks when a man is in the Beit Midrash studying and somebody hurts them, dishonors them, so they go tell their wife, and they tell them what happened, and then the wife makes fun of that person. So that's why it's not a good idea. Okay. All that is from Avot Rabbi Natan. But my point is that Avot Rabbi Natan proves that the Mishnah stops with all tarbeh siha Ha-Isha. Okay, so you're going to say to me, okay, but it still says, don't talk too much with a woman, right? What's all that about? I'll tell you what's it about. Let's read it again. Now that we know that the rest of the Mishnah was superimposed, let's read the Mishnah in its original. Yosi Ben Yohanan from Jerusalem said, your house should be wide open, and you should allow poor people to come into your house. And I'll paraphrase just to make the point, and don't discuss this with your wife, because she's going to say no, because she has to cook the food, because she has to set up the table, because she has to wash the dishes. Just bring the poor people in. You understand what Yosi Ben Yohanan? And then it makes sense. There's a connection. Yosi Ben Yohanan was saying, I know that your wife runs the home, and it's very hard to bring in these poor people without telling her. So don't tell her the whole story of all the poor people you want to bring home, because of course she's going to say no. Miskena, what can you do? Of course she's going to say no. Okay, now that before you think that this is a newfangled interpretation that I made up, you should know this is the interpretation of Don Isaac Abarbanel from 15th century Spain. He says, this is obviously what the Mishnah means. Why all of a sudden is he telling you not to talk to the woman? Because your wife is going to freak out when she sees these poor people coming for dinner all the time. So he says, look, this is a mitzvah. She'll get used to it. So don't tell her too much about what you're planning to do, because she's going to freak out. That's basically, and in my opinion, this is the simple meaning of this Mishnah. Okay, now that I said that, I'm going to challenge my own interpretation. The Talmud in Eruvin brings a story. And the story is from the 2nd century of the Common Era, over 300 years later. Story is Rabbi Yossi Haglili was walking on the way and he bumped into Bruria. Bruria, the famous wife of Rabbi Meir, who was also a scholar. And he says to her, can you tell me which road I have to take to the city of Lod? Bruria looks at him and possibly with irony he says, you idiotic Galilean, Galilei Tipshai, don't you know that the sages said not to talk too much to women? You should have said, which road Lod, period. Okay, the Talmud in Eruvin. Now, obviously, there's irony going on in this story, and it looks like Bruria is being a little facetious. In other words, from the time of Yosi Ben Yohanan, who made the famous statement in relationship to a very specific statement, people started using this phrase out of context for many things, and Bruria did not like it. So she's playing with Yosi Haglili and saying, you're asking me which road to take to go to Lod. You're not supposed to talk so much to a woman. I'm even a woman married to, by the way, she didn't know that commentary of Avot Rabbi Natan, because it was probably written after the 2nd century. According to all opinions, it was written after the 2nd century, so she probably didn't even know that opinion of Avot Rabbi Natan. But they did know the statement of Yosi Ben Yohanan, and obviously this statement was used by certain people who wanted to say something. And also remember, we're talking about the 2nd century. We are well into the Roman period. So that being a little misogynist is acceptable in Roman society. I don't think that Jews went that far, but when you live in a society which thinks a certain way, it's going to affect things that you say. And you might quote things from the sages that you might not have quoted out of context unless society saw it as politically correct. So Bruria is making fun of Yosi Haglili Obviously, her statement is full of irony, but obviously she's a little bit offended that people are quoting it out of context, what's going on. And to make things worse, as you can see, by the Islamic period, it actually makes its way into Avot Rabbi Natan, and it becomes a general statement having nothing to do with the first statement of Yosi Ben Yohanan. It becomes now in general not to talk idle talk to women. Now, before I continue, I have to also explain what that means, because everything has to be understood. Even though it becomes more politically correct to make a statement like this, the statement has to be understood. Al tarbeh siha Ha-Isha means don't talk too much idol worship with your wife. Idle gossip, I'm sorry. Do not gossip too much. The word siha in Hebrew, in Talmudic Hebrew, is always siha b'teila or sichat chulin. It's always idle gossip. So in other words, you can talk idle gossip to your wife, but don't overdo it. But even this statement was superimposed on the Mishnah because it's not clear that's what Yosi Ben Yohanan was even talking about. He was talking about, don't tell your wife too much that you're planning to bring all these poor people in. It's not clear that she'll accept it. So break it to her gently, piece by piece. That's what he means. Don't tell her the whole story, or else she's going to say no, and you won't be able to do it. In other words, you have to do it, and then you'll help her a little bit with the dishes. You'll help her prepare, then, she won't freak out. You might have to limit it after a while, but that's really Yosi Ben Yohanan. He sees a big inyan of bringing people in, and be careful how you present it to your wife. But as I said, by the 7th to 9th century, this becomes a commentary in the Avot Rabbi Natan on this Mishnah. It becomes a commentary. Now, just to show you how in a patriarchal society, which is really the whole world until the 20th century, and even, I would say, even until the second half of the 20th century, Rashi is living in 11th century France. He was born in Germany, in what becomes Germany eventually, in the city of Worms and Vermaisa, and he lived later on in Troyes. And Rashi is very uncomfortable with what he sees in front of him, this statement of Yosi Ben Yohanan, because Rashi only sees the statement the same way we see it in our Mishnah. And so he has a problem with it, because Rashi is living already in a Jewish society which has more respect for their women, and it doesn't understand why our sages will all of a sudden say, don't talk to women. I mean, what's that all about? Why not just say, you can also say, don't talk to ignoramuses, don't talk to the enemy. What is this statement? Why all of a sudden misogyny? And he's very puzzled. So let me read you what Rashi says in the 11th century. Rashi says, Al tarbeh siha Ha-Isha. He says, even if it's your wife, because Rashi was familiar with the Avot Rabbi Natan and this addition, this appendix to the Pirkei Avot, which was superimposed. And he says, why is it that it says this? It's keeping away from the words of Torah. And he says, and I saw in a copy of Avot Rabbi Natan, the book I just showed you before, in a copy of the Avot Rabbi Natan, according to the version that we have in France, it says not to talk too much with your wife during her period. Meaning, you're talking a lot to your wife. The two of you are in love. If you talk too much during her period, it might bring you to things that halachically you're supposed to refrain from during that time. But do you understand what Rashi is doing here? By saying that this appendix of the Mishnah is only talking about when your wife is during her menstrual cycle, which is when halachically you have to keep away physically, he's saying it's not a general statement. It's an advisatory statement because, couples, sometimes it's hard for them to control themselves during this period of time. And that's what the statement has to do with. So Rashi is reinterpreting this whole appendix in a different way. But then he says, and it says the whole thing is to keep people away from having relationships during the time of the nidah, during the time of the menstrual cycle. He says, but he says, I know there's another version, and the other version talks about the regular wife having nothing to do with that. And this is the version of Avot Rabbi Natan, which was brought from the land of Israel. I am familiar with that too. But Rashi is trying to save the day by reinterpreting based on the version of Avot Rabbi Natan in France. By the way, this is the time to say that in the 11th and 12th century, by the way, the Tosafists, the generation after Rashi, are very much into women's rights. Professor Avram Grossman, in his book Tzadikot Mordot, and he also talks about, he has other studies about Ashkenazic Jewry in the 11th and 12th century. So he talks a lot about takanot that were made for women's rights during that time. For instance, you have the famous takana that women are not allowed, that a man is not allowed to do yibum, which is a Torah mitzvah. A person has to do chalitza. If a woman dies and she had no children, if a man dies and he had no children, according to the Torah, his brother is supposed to marry his widow in order to have children. That's called yibum, a levirate marriage. They're allowed to do chalitza, but the rabbis of Ashkenaz forced chalitza. They made a gezerah that yibum is not allowed, period, because they knew that it can create blackmail from the man to the woman, and other takanot were done during this time in Ashkenaz for the benefit of women. So Rashi, who is living in that atmosphere, is wondering about this statement and where it comes from. I'm not sure if Rashi realized it was superimposed on the Mishnah, because his Mishnah already had it. I just said it was superimposed from the Avot Rabbi Natan, which was written during the Islamic period. But it's just interesting, though, how Rashi is trying to solve the problem, because he realizes that something seems to be out of context here. I want to just quote to you for a moment. In the Encyclopedia Judaica, they have a little discussion here on women in Judaism, and and he says, look, there are some things which happen to be a little bit anti, but most things are usually positive. And for instance, he brings the famous quote, I'm not sure if I see it here though, from Bereshit Rabbah. In Genesis Rabbah, I'm sorry that I don't see it right in front of him. Yes, in Genesis Rabbah, it says that when God wanted to create Eve from Adam's rib, he said, I will not create her from the head that she shouldn't be too proud, not from the ear that she should not be an eavesdropper, not from the mouth that should be too talkative, not from the heart that should be too jealous, not from the hand that should be too inquisitive, not by the foot that should be gad about, but from the part of the body which is hidden, which is modest. But he says, and despite this, women are greedy, eavesdropping, lazy, jealous, etc. And this is Genesis Rabbah 45. Which is very strange. Why all of a sudden are you saying this about women in general? Why not? There are a lot of men like that too. My father, in his commentary on Genesis Rabbah 45, he says, I would have rather if this midrash was not written at the time. But if you look at the names of the midrash who are writing at the time, they are people who are living well into the Roman period. And as I said, it's a society, the Roman period, where misogyny is politically correct. So, sometimes a person goes through a certain experience of life and they won't say something if they think it's the wrong thing to say. But sometimes when they live in a society where it's cool to say these things, I'm talking about Roman society, they think if we make a statement like this, it's almost humorous, okay? And today we don't look at it as humorous as they did. I'm just saying that there can be differences in the society in which the scholars are living. However, when you look at the general statements of what it says about a woman in our tradition, it says a man without a wife is without joy, without blessing, without good. And a man should love his wife as himself and respect her more than himself. Yevamot 62. It says when Rabbi Yosef heard the footsteps of his mother coming, he would say, "Let me arise before the Shekhinah," the divine presence, comes in. Kiddushin 31. It says Israel was redeemed from Egypt by the virtue of righteous women. Sota 11. A man has to be careful never to speak slighting to his wife, because women are prone to tears. Baba Metzia 59. Women have greater faith than men. The Midrash Sifra on Bamidbar 133, and greater discernment. Nida 45. They're tender-hearted. Megillah 14. The Torah, the greatest joy of the rabbis, is very often the mashal, the analogy is to woman. Okay. So, I mean, I don't have to prove to you that we have a lot of sources which are very, very pro-woman in ways which wouldn't make sense to the Greeks and to the Romans. But I'm just saying that on the occasion, if you do see something which seems to be a little bit misogynist, you also have to look at what period it's being written, because there will be influences to a certain extent, but the influences will always be minor, because in the end all, these statements from Antiquity are known, and nobody's going to change them in that sense. So getting back to our Mishnah, which we start with at the beginning, this Mishnah, and I think really it's according to Don Isaac Abarbanel's interpretation, Yosi Ben Yohanan is really talking about Gemilut Chasadim, doing charity, opening up your house and bringing in the poor. And he realizes it's not going to be easy for your wife to accept this, so don't tell her too much about this, right? And give her an inkling of what's going on. You're going to invite a few poor people, etc. But break it to her very slowly. And don't tell her you're planning to do this every Shabbat or every Wednesday or whatever it's going to be, because it's a lot. And people have to come around to this idea. It's not easy working with poor people. I also want to end with an interesting thing that Rashi says about this. What does it mean, let your house be wide open? By the way, Avot Rabbi Natan, just to say that not everything's so negative there, they have a very interesting parallel. He says that this Mishnah is talking about Job, who used to open his tent in 4 ways to let all the poor people come in. Rashi, however, says, what does it mean that you should open your house to the poor? He says, it's not good to have a lot of servants. It's better bring in poor people, let them do the work, and pay them for the work. And therefore, you're really doing to them a great favor, because you're not giving them for the food for free. You're giving them food, and you're paying them for their labor so they can have respect. Okay? Very interesting insights of Rashi from the 11th century. So this is ideas that I want to say, and we have to understand that there are changes. We have a tradition of the way we see women, which in general is positive. But obviously there are going to be some influences here and there over the generations, whether you're in Persian culture, which was actually quite favorable to women in a sense, even though it was patriarchal. Greek and Roman culture, which was less favorable to women. The Greeks were the first to become misogynist. And then, of course, you have our 11th, 12th century culture, in which women's rights are outstanding more, especially in Ashkenaz at the time. And then you also have commentaries in Spain, like Don Isaac Abarbanel in the 15th century, who also didn't understand why it was necessary to make statements that seem negative about women. So it's important to also understand the historical settings, also to realize what Yosi Ben Yohanan was actually saying and the relationship to the Mishnah. It was not really a misogynist statement, in my opinion, but the Avot Rabbi Natan, which gets its final editing back in the Islamic period of Babylonia in the 9th to the 11th century, it sort of throws within the back window statements which were probably things that people were saying at that time. Be careful, if women are not scholarly, they're not going to understand why you're studying Torah, they're going to take you away, whatever. I'm not clear to me that this is the way the people in the Mishnah thought in the time of Yosi Ben Yohanan, but possibly there might have been currents like this in Babylonia in the 7th to the 9th century. Shalom, shalom, and I hope we're able to think about these things in I hope it creates discussion. Shalom for everyone.